Okay, so we have a couple chapters to talk about. We have the Revolutionary War, the creation of the Constitution, and this new nation time period. I guess I can start off by asking: is there any big questions that people have that you want me to talk about or go over? Yeah, talk about things. Pretty much, yeah. I think some of the things in here will be helpful for the writing section, but I kind of use the SP 30 times for the essays. So I'm going to talk about things. Okay, let's first start off by getting from the end of the French and Indian War to Declaration of Independence. So French and Indian War ends, right? And the British win. One of the main impetuses of change is going to be the Proclamation of 1763. Remember, that's when the British Army is stationed along the Appalachian Mountains to prevent any colonists from going across the mountains. They're doing this because they don't want there to be conflict between Native Americans and the colonists who could be moving to the west. Colonists are upset by this, right? This changes their relationship with the British because they feel like, hey, we fought and died for this war. In this war, we fought for this land. I should be able to take it. And they basically say, no. So remember, war is expensive. The British have a huge debt to pay because of this war. And they're going to do that by raising taxes. We have things like the Stamp Act, where all these printed documents get this special stamp that costs money. And so now all these different taxes are being levied on the people and they don't like it. And so both because there is, I guess, upset feelings about the Stamp Act and because of people continuing to move west across the mountains even though they're not supposed to, the British Army is reinforced with more soldiers. And so because with all these soldiers, they passed the Quartering Act, which said that the states had to provide barracks for them. In some cases, that meant the actual state building and paying for housing for the soldiers. In other cases, that meant soldiers knocking down on people's doors and saying, we're going to live here. And it's all part of the Quartering Act. So I think it's important to notice these changes, like Stamp Act, Quartering Act, Proclamation of 1763, happens right after the war. These are direct consequences of the war and being out of money, being in debt. And it's only a little bit later that they passed the Townshend Acts. Where they take some goods, some specific goods, and put a tax on it. Indigo, wool, lumber. I'm sorry, not that. Paper, paint, glass, tea. Okay. Especially remember that tea one, because that one's going to become significant later, right? Paper, paint, glass, tea. Anything that's imported into the colonies will be taxed. And so now we've had 4 straight years of continuous taxing. The British subjects, the colonists in New England don't like these policies, right? They are really big into trading. And so this is going to hurt their bottom line. And so we see kind of 2 methods of resistance. Do you remember what those 2 methods were? That's one way they responded. right? Where you refuse to buy this stuff, right? They're importing all this stuff from Great Britain. The price has gone up, and they say, fine, we're just not going to buy it. What else could they do? There's one that was more violent. Not yet. Not quite rebel. Yeah, so I guess violent responses could be stuff like burning people in effigy or tar and feathering. This is mostly going to happen in Boston. Okay, so a lot of the boycotts start in Boston. Most of the violent responses take place in Boston. And so that sends more soldiers into Boston to deal with the violent responses, meaning the states have to pay for more housing for soldiers under the Quartering Act, which eventually is going to lead to the Boston Massacre. So I think if you remember like the causes and effects of all these events, like it's kind of it makes more sense to put them in order. Like, okay, they're charging for more money. Oh, the soldiers need to come in because the people don't like it. Oh, now they want more taxes, so they're going to import goods. Well, they just say they're not going to buy it. They're going to be violent about it. Oh, they got to send more soldiers. That leads to the Boston Massacre. So all of it like makes sense in order. I think sometimes like with all these laws, it just turns into like just memorize them. But if you like look at them in order, I think it really tells a clear story. It's just like the British do something, the colonists respond. British do something again, the colonists respond. Right? Like after the Boston Massacre and all this controversy over it, they get rid of most of the townshend acts, right? Most of those taxes on imported goods goes away except for one. What was it? Tea, right? The tax on tea remains. This gets people more upset, leads to the Boston Tea Party, right? Where they destroy things, they damage property. And what was the effect, or I guess what was the response by the British from the Boston Tea Party? The Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Act. The British called them coercive acts. The colonists called them intolerable. You can't tolerate them. Remember, they did things like they targeted Boston and they closed down Boston Harbor. They shut down the town meetings that gave people political rights in the colonies. They're doing all these things against it, right? So what's the response? Okay, for each of these, you can always say, like, what is the response from the other side? So what does the colonies do in response to the Intolerable Acts? The meeting that they set up. First Continental Congress. And the whole point of this group is to say, get rid of the Intolerable Acts, regain our rights as Englishmen. Remember, they're not talking about independence. But by the next year, tension is raising so much that some in Boston, with the amount of soldiers that are now coming to Boston, begin raising weapons, right? And collecting weapons to possibly use against them. We have people like Minutemen preparing for a possible attack to defend their hometowns. And that eventually leads to the fight where? Lexington and Concord. Remember, the British soldiers are looking for weapons, and they meet a group of Minutemen in Lexington. This is the shot heard around the world. This is the first major shot of the Revolutionary War. So we have Lexington and Concord. By this point, we have the Second Continental Congress. And Second Continental Congress is going to demand more rights, right? Rights as Englishmen. They're going to adopt an army. They're going to appoint George Washington as the general of the army. And by early 1776, we have common sense. Right, the pamphlet written by Thomas Paine, arguing for republicanism, the idea of people being able to vote for their representatives, not having a king. We need to fight for independence. This is one of the first times where we have something like independence being talked about out loud in public. So we go on. Eventually, the Second Continental Congress passes the Declaration of Independence. And the war starts. We don't need to know very many battles. Lexington and Concord we talked about. The next one we probably have to know is the Battle of Saratoga. Remember that ensured a French alliance. Throughout this war, they're trying to not only fight a war, but also like start their own government. Okay, we haven't talked about yet in the textbook, but they've already created the Articles of Confederation and creating their own government. They create their own paper currency. Remember, whenever we have a war that leads to inflation, especially with an economic system that is a baby and not set up right, there's a whole bunch of problems with it. So we have mass inflation with colonial, now American money, to the point where it's pretty much worthless. And we don't need to know about the whole rest of the war, really. The next thing is the Battle of Yorktown. This is where Cornwallis surrenders. Basically signaling the end of the war. And once this happens, they sign the Treaty of Paris. Now, 1783. This got U.S. independence and sovereignty. They are now their own country. Great Britain had to recognize that. They get the land to the Mississippi River. They even get fishing rights over certain areas of land or certain areas of the ocean off the coast of Canada. Any questions about pre-Revolutionary War, Revolutionary War itself? You feel comfortable with that, we think? That's going to be when we have like they're going to want to petition for peace. Once we have more and more violence happening in Boston, like these violent responses increase after the coercive acts, after the first Continental Congress disbands, those will increase. And with that, there's this more British response to that, more British soldiers. And so that leads them to Second Continental Congress, where initially they say, hey, let's send a peace treaty, an olive branch petition to the king, and that doesn't work, and that's the sign that they're gonna have to put it in. Okay. Talk about after the war. Okay. Let's go to after the war. I think I'm recording. Okay, so we have a new founding document, the Articles of Confederation. With the Articles of Confederation, we have strong states, right? There are things like no president of the United States, no Supreme Court of the United States. Difficult to pass laws. So on the voting threshold under the Articles of Confederation, you needed a supermajority, so like 60 or 70% of Congress to vote on something for an important law to pass. For example, a tariff, which is a tax on an imported good. They tried to pass tariffs with this new country to raise money for the national government. Under the Articles, they couldn't do it. They couldn't agree on it, so they couldn't get difficult laws passed. And so with all these problems facing the Articles of Federation, it's only a matter of time before there's an emergency that shows that the Articles can't live up to an emergency moment, which is going to be Shays' Rebellion. Remember, we don't need to know like the causes of the Shays' Rebellion. What's more important for us is the effect of it. Because while Daniel Shays dies during the rebellion, his rebellion is not met with pretty much any resistance from the government. The national government is not able to respond quickly enough to an emergency like Shays' Rebellion. And that was a signal to many people in power that, okay, the Articles of Federation maybe is not working. If we can't deal with an emergency in our own land, our own borders, this is not good for future, like bigger catastrophes. You know, what if the British invade and it's just going to take way too much time. Articles of Federation is just not a good system. Okay. The only real positive thing that comes of the Articles are things like the Northwest Ordinance. Remember, this created the Northwest Territory. Places like Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois are all part of this territory. First, it made slavery illegal there, and it also created the process for how a territory can become a state. They said if enough people live in this certain territory, they can apply to become a state. So this is like the one big positive thing that comes out of the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so if you were writing a supposed essay about how things are bad in the Articles and better in the Constitution, a counter argument could be something like, well, the Northwest Ordinance was done under the Articles and that wasn't so bad. Hypothetically. Yeah. I talked about it in SP 30. Could they do it in the Constitution? Yes. Yeah, they could do it in the Constitution, but it shows that you could get something done. The Articles wasn't completely useless. So, I mean, it was mostly useless, but not completely. So they get together at the Constitutional Convention. And remember, the big arguments are going to be surrounded over representation. How do you determine representation in Congress? And so they come up with the Great Compromise, where they say Congress is going to be split into two parts. The first part is the House of Representatives. That's going to be set up by population. And we have the Senate, which is going to be equal representation. Okay, so this makes small states happy, big states happy. But the controversy doesn't end there. Northern states were upset that enslaved people who had no political rights at the time would be counted as a full person under representation. And they were upset that those states where slavery was legal would have more power than they should have, or what they thought they should have. And so they developed the 3/5 Compromise. That took away some of the representation from southern states based on how many enslaved people were counted. So instead of slave states getting more power if enslaved people were counted for every person, they only counted 3/5 of the total population of enslaved people as a penalty for having enslaved people. Questions on that? So 3/5 Compromise, Great Compromise, all fights over representation and power in Congress. 3/5 Compromise is specifically about slavery. Okay. They eventually create this Constitution. It gives the national government more power. They now have a president of the United States. They're going to have a Supreme Court of the United States, although they haven't really defined what that looks like yet. But here's the thing, in order for the Constitution to actually go into effect, they have to go and get 3/4 of the states to agree to it. And so they go out and try to tell people and convince people to support the Constitution. And the most famous way that they tried to convince people to support the Constitution was a series of articles written in newspapers that we now call what? Federalist Papers. Right, written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. These are documents written to persuade Americans to support the ratification of Congress. Ratification means you are approving, you're voting to approve of something. And once you approve of it, it goes into effect. Through the help of the Federalist Papers, the Constitution is approved of. We have a new Constitution, which means we need to set up this government. They elect George Washington as first president. And we're going to talk about Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury. John Adams is Vice President, Jefferson, Secretary of State, Henry Knox, the Secretary of War. Hamilton is the Secretary of Treasury. And the job of the Secretary of Treasury is to deal with money issues in the United States. And so he's going to create a financial plan that he thinks is going to set us on a good foundation. So he's going to argue for assumption of state debt. Remember, all these states have war debts from the Revolutionary War. They have to pay it off. And Hamilton says, hey, we can get some buy-in for this idea of a new country if the new country takes on those state debts. Although some states have already paid it off because of their use of slave labor. States like Virginia have mostly paid off their state debts already and don't like this plan. That leads to, if you've watched the Hamilton musical, that leads to the whole song Room Where It Happens, where they're arguing about assumption of state debt and where the national capital will go, which eventually will go in between Maryland and Virginia. So we have the assumption of state debt that ends up happening. We have the Bank of the United States, or the BUS. Remember, the Bank of the United States is a bank set up partially by the government and partially by private investors. They work together, and the idea is they're going to do all of the money things for the country. Okay, if we have to pay a debt to another country, the bank does that. If we need to collect tariffs or taxes, the Bank of the United States does that. It's also going to collect tariffs to pay off this debt. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, they weren't able to do that before. Now it's much easier to get that done. And they're going to push for excise taxes. So they tax specific goods, and they're going to target a lot of goods made by farmers, especially things that is used to create whiskey. So if you are a whiskey distiller, you're not going to like this. So what's the effect of the whiskey excise tax? Whiskey Rebellion, right? Where the whiskey distillers in Western Pennsylvania will rebel. And because of that excise tax, they'll rebel. But something happens differently than the Shays Rebellion. What's different about this one? Yeah, President Washington gets on his horse and he's going to try to stop the Whiskey Rebellion. And once they hear that Washington is coming with a bunch of soldiers, they all run away and no one wants to fight Washington. So this shows the strength of the Constitution, that yes, they can deal with emergencies very quickly. And the last thing we're going to say about Washington's presidency is during this time period, remember, France is going through its own revolution. They begin a fight with Great Britain. And with this fight, Washington decides to join whose side? Neither side. Trick question. He issues the Neutrality Proclamation, where he says we are not going to join either side. We're going to be neutral. We're going to trade with both. But a consequence for that is that both countries get mad at us, right, for trading with the other side, and so they start stopping our ships and taking our supplies and kidnapping our men. And so that's going to lead to more problems later. 1795, 94, like that. I'm not going to ask that question. Okay. Okay. Any questions before we're done for the day? Okay, so I will be posting this video on Google Classroom too if you want to watch it later, or if you're talking to a friend and they're like, "Oh, I couldn't go this morning," just say, "Hey, that the review session was videotaped and is put on Google Classroom." Thanks, everybody.